Welcome, everyone. Um, so my name is Josh Bengal. I am the Government Relations Director and in-house counsel for the Medical Society of New Jersey. And I am really excited to welcome you all to this special presentation tonight on AI in medicine. Now, this will be the fourth course in MSNJ's new lecture series. And through this series, we really aim to be, I would say, one of the preeminent medical education sources in the state. And in this way, bring real value to members and to the medical community generally. Now, before we dive into this, what I would say is truly, and I think you'll all agree, if you're here tonight, a fascinating topic, I must admit I took a very modern approach to planning this very brief introduction, and I asked AI to help me craft what I am saying right now. So I will say, if it is perfect, if you like it, I take all of the credit, and if not, you know who to blame. So tonight, we are honored to have two distinguished experts with us to present and to educate us on this important topic. First, we have Dr. Kennedy Gonti, past president of MSNJ. He is a board-certified family physician and a clinical informatician. He currently serves as the regional vice president of health informatics at RWJBarnabas Health. A thought leader in the state and nationally in the health informatics arena, he is also an advocate for integrating advanced technologies to improve patient care. Dr. Gonti's insights into how AI is transforming the medical landscape are invaluable. And tonight he'll be providing us with a general overview, not only of AI in medicine, but also of the history, where we have been in the past, which will lead us to where we are going. And that will be covered by our esteemed MSNJ member, Dr. Tina Shah. Dr. Shah is a pulmonary and critical care physician and a national expert in workforce burnout, digital health, and health policy generally. She previously served in multiple White House administrations and as a senior advisor to the U.S. Surgeon General. In her current role as Chief Clinical Officer of Abridge, a generative AI company, she is helping develop tools that cut down clinician time spent on administrative burdens and revolutionizing how physicians interact with technology. She is making healthcare more efficient and effective, and for this, we all thank her. Dr. Shah will delve into the specifics of ambient AI, which is an important and unique component piece of the AI landscape, as this is her area of expertise. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gonti and Dr. Shah. Let's give them our full attention as they share their expertise on this exciting and groundbreaking subject. So thank you. And Dr. Gonti, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate the opportunity of the Medical Society extended to myself and my colleague, Tina, to discuss with you some of the landscape currently in the artificial intelligence arena. Much has been made, especially in healthcare, and many systems are actually moving to forms of AI, including forms that you can see, like what Dr. Shah is going to talk to you about, and a lot of things you cannot see. So many of the things we're going to talk about, but we're going to start from some very, very interesting basics and move you up to the modern day. So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to share my screen. Share, and we'll start our presentation. Just a little intro for the Medical Society of New Jersey and my deep gratitude for their support of this program.
I have to jump in. That's so beautiful and classy. I don't think I've seen that before. It's gorgeous.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about a brief history of the artificial intelligence of medicine, as we know it, right? Much ado has been made about it, and we're going to have a retrospective. And really the idea comes from looking at history, and I want to credit my inspiration to Dr. Peter Blumenthal, who is both the resident historian and I will say poet laureate of the Medical Society. And the idea of covering history is always a good thing to do. And I know Dr. Blumenthal would approve. So you've served as inspiration for this approach, Peter. So to move on, we're going to actually here have an overview. First, we will talk about a timeline-based approach where we're going to discuss the technology, the tools, and comment on the evolution of clinical medicine in key areas, both in medicine as well as healthcare policy. We're going to talk about the history of computing and how it's influenced the evolution of artificial intelligence, of medicine, and what we knew at the time. And we're going to get to the point where, how did we get here, right? And then here is where Dr. Tina Shah will be discussing what the current state is and what we should be looking forward to. So now, we're now going to have a visual approach to what we're going to talk about in AI and medicine. We're going to start at the very beginning. Time of dinosaurs, not quite, but yes, for computing, yes. So we're going to talk about the first computer called ENIAC, and it was created in 1945 at the Electrical Engineering Department right over the river at University of Pennsylvania. And that was the very first major computer. First, mostly academic, but it set new ground. And then several years later, the creators moved on and commercialized ENIAC into UNIVAC 1. And as computing technology started to evolve, so did uses by the military-industrial complex, as well as state and federal governments. So then you had the evolution of two other computers called the Digital Equipment Corporation, PDP-1, and their line of computers, and then Big Blue, IBM, the System 360. So while all of these, why do we need to talk about computers? They need to be able to run sophisticated software or be sophisticated enough for certain applications. So the first major application relevant to medicine is Dendral. It is the first expert system, if you will, rules-based system that evaluates certain data fed into the computer and then comes out with a result based on the rule. So this applied to chemistry and molecular structures. So as we're getting through the 60s, computing power is becoming more and more significant and becoming available, but mostly at research institutions. So here we go, a picture, ENIAC, filled literally part of a building, and is still in existence. It's at a museum on campus at the University of Pennsylvania. And then you had UNIVAC. You can sort of see a bit of more density, more things going on there. And then opposed to that, the PDP-1, which was much more efficient because it actually had a keyboard interface. And then all of that evolves into the IBM System 360. So computers are starting to get more and more capable. So take note, in 1969, the company Meditech was founded. Yes, Meditech. They've done a lot in healthcare, including an EHR program. And then now we'll move to the seminal moment in electronics history is the Intel 4004, which is the first microprocessor. So computers up until this time took as much space as they did is because they used vacuum tubes. And that is how you represent binary code and how you have to assemble them. That's how they knew how to do it until the first microprocessor. And then now, from a development standpoint, hold on to your seatbelts. And even the founder of Intel, Gordon Moore, came up and is accredited with Moore's Law, stating in 1965 that the transistor density of semiconductor chips would double roughly every 18 months. And that would continue to be almost 40 years later. Okay, where the hallmark, the great benchmark here was the Pentium when it crossed 1 million transistors on board. Okay, now you see that extended in a couple of decades later. So you have a sense that computing power is becoming very small and it's also getting cheaper. So that has a huge ripple effect in the computing industry. But is there something else we're missing? Yes. Medical knowledge growth puts Moore's Law to shame. And you'll see before you that in 1950, the doubling of medical knowledge was every 50 years. In 1980, every 7 years. In 2010, 3.5 years. And in 2011, at the time some of these information was made available, it was projected that it will be about 73 days by 2020. So can we say now safely that every 30, 60 days that medical knowledge is doubling? Between that and Moore's law, there is a tsunami of change that's about to happen. So you have the first expert system, Mycin, that was developed as a rule-based engine to identify bacteria. This was innovated through a graduate student named Ted Shortliff at Stanford University, who worked with some of the computing power that he had available to him there. And then you have the first AI winter, so to speak. So from 1975 till about 1990, where interest in development and investment in AI, or at that time, the real understanding buzzword was expert systems. Computing power was just not enough to really call it intelligence. While it did pass what's called the Turing test, they weren't terribly sophisticated, and they certainly weren't every place. The only places that can afford these computers had them. So then you've had other innovations. As microchips grew in density and then became smaller, one of the first supercomputers, the Cray 1, debuted. Okay, and then you've had the innovation here at Rutgers University in the 1978 was CASNet, the first convoluted neural network that was applied to ophthalmology, replicating the visual cortex trying to attempt to replicate the visual cortex of the human brain, and then was able to be used as an expert system to help diagnose certain eye diseases, particularly glaucoma. Of note, it debuted in 1976 at the Academy of Ophthalmology meeting. So very, very interesting story for CASNet. And one of its co-founders, Dr. Kazimir Kulikowski, is still teaching at Rutgers and still working in the field today. So then in 1979, and some people are thinking this, EPIC systems are founded. Yes, EPIC is founded in 1979, and then not to be outdone, so is Cerner. So this would then lead the revolution of the rise of HIEs and EHRs. And that is what contributes to the two AI winters that are described in the literature, where now the focus on diagnosis and using computers for diagnosis and thinking moved to now capturing this tsunami of information, documentation, being paid for it, and then eventually evolving into exchange. In fact, HIEs also grew with computers as networks are happening, as we will see in the history before you. So in 1981, the IBM PC is introduced. And then Oncosin, which is the successor of Mycin, is a expert system, rules-based expert system for diagnosis in oncology. So then, shortly thereafter, you have the debut of Internist 1 at the University of Pittsburgh, which innovates by making more efficient rules-based engines to then talk about general diagnosis in internal medicine. And can a computer help with general diagnosis instead of just specialty domains? And in 1984, the Apple Macintosh is introduced. This really is a major innovation because it took what we now take for granted, the graphical user interface, and introduced it to the mass market. And thus the microcomputer revolution. PCs, Macs, they're all now interchangeable topics, but having that kind of computer do what that could do in 1984 was seminal. And then, not to be outdone, Microsoft, IBM, and the PC revolution took off, and then eventually overtook the Macintosh to what we now see today. And then you have CA-Diag2, which was used fuzzy logic with the newly founded Lisp programming system. Not widely available, and it's not really known which computer actually ran it. And then you had the Cardio-E, which was a rule-based system for analysis of cardiac arrhythmias that was confined to a mobile device, thereby seeding the generation of remote monitoring that we have today. And then you have the differential diagnosis engine called DXplain, innovated at the University of Massachusetts. As you begin to see the strength of the microcomputer revolution, DXplain is still available on the web. So to summarize some of the forebears of artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence as we know today. You have Dendral for chemical analysis, CASNet, Mycin, Internist-1, CA-Diag, and Cardio-2. And you see the evolution of the computers that it and eventually worked on with the kind of different evolutions and revolutions we saw in the computing field. So now, this is seminal because Acorn releases the Archimedes computer, the first RISC computer. And the computer wasn't anything spectacular to talk about, but the processor was a predecessor of what we now know as the ARM processor, which now is becoming more and more ubiquitous because of mobile computing. And then in 1993, Intel debuts the Pentium processor, which is the first high-density chip to cross 1 million transistors. So now you're having this massive innovation in microcomputers. You're having, really the downsizing of computing technology. So by the end of this decade, by the end of the 90s, you're starting to see the rise of the handhelds, the PDAs. And so all of this technology is becoming ubiquitous and usable. So then what ends up happening as a major policy response is President George W. Bush recognizing some of the issues in patient safety nationally from the studies called To Err Is Human and Crossing the Quality Chasm, that we needed to begin on working on a digital backbone for the United States for exchanging healthcare information digitally. It was quite a vision at the time, and he nominated Dr. David Brailer of the Santa Barbara Health Information Exchange to lead the first office of the National Coordinator of HIT. And this is a big deal because it was also funded with $100 million at the time, which was significant funding. So, this initiative really kicked off with health records with President Bush. And so now we're going to fast forward to 2007. Again, computing is becoming more ubiquitous. Things are getting cheaper, faster. You have the internet now. And now you have IBM Watson, a supercomputer which debuts its deep learning model called DeepQA. So this is really I think the inflection points in artificial intelligence in medicine. So up until this point, we have been using computing models that take rules that we have learned from observations to create rules to then tell us based on variance, what these diagnoses can be. Now that's called deductive expert systems. Now, DeepQA had the power and the ability to look at all these million data points, look for relationships, and then inductively come to a decision. That's a big deal. That allows for the explosion in data to be harnessed for common use. So that's what DeepQA did. And then the iPhone, the game changer. Why? We'll talk about this in a second. And then the meaningful use era. So after President Barack Obama took office, one of his stark realities is that Medicare was going to become insolvent in 2017. So how was he going to develop programs to keep Medicare solvent? Well, he had to have the digital backbone that President Bush started to put together. And then what he did is turbocharged it with $20 billion. And behind that is the famous Meaningful Use program that many of us have survived or succeeded in and helped digitize what we know into healthcare today. So now you see the rise of processing power, really this last couple of decades, the IBM Watson supercomputer. Yes, Big Blue, a variant of Watson, did beat the Jeopardy champion. And then Steve Jobs introduces the iPhone, which again takes supercomputing power of the 80s and 90s, puts it in your hand, if you really think about it that way. And then you have new supercomputers like the IBM Roadrunner, which use the Power XL81 and the AMD Opteron microprocessors. But then there's an offshoot of that XL, which ended up being the microprocessor for the Sony PlayStation 3, and it's the XL8i. Really tremendous to see what the evolution has been and how you can now literally have yesterday's supercomputers in your hand today. And then comes the paper Attention All You Need in 2017, as comes from the research arm from Google that talks about these neural networks, these inductive networks, talking about the transformer type of neural networks and how they power what we know today as large language models, leading to today's technology. And then in 2018, which will now usher in the modern era, will be what we talk about OpenAI and their revolutionary technology called GPT, which is general all-purpose transformer. What's this? A transformer. Oh, no, not this one. No. No, this is not the transformer we're talking about. We're talking about a statistical network. However, neural networks do power robotics. Maybe a vision of tomorrow to come. And that's our short history of artificial intelligence in medicine. Thank you very much, everyone. And now to Dr. Tina Shaw.
Dr. Ganti, thank you so much. It's actually remarkable to have gone through that and to have really taken us even further back. It's not just having, let's call it the technology, the software, but it's actually having the computing power. And I don't know if I quite put it together like how you depicted. So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides as well and really just pick up from where you left off. And let me see if I can get to my screen here. And let me know if you can't see it, but I think you can. So here we are. We just went through this story of how computers got really, really small, but also got really, really good at doing lots of things fast. And then there was a Sentinel paper that Kennedy mentioned called that was about transformers in healthcare, or the T in ChatGPT. So we morphed from AI that's been actually around since the 1950s to generative AI. So I want to give you two examples of kind of what those two things are and really drill into what generative AI is. AI. I use branching logic, and I can tell you if this picture is a cat or it's not a cat, right? So we can kind of sort of see the pathway where we train a computer to look for certain things. Don't quote me here. Are the whiskers long? You know, like all these different little things, and maybe differentiate cats from dogs and eventually come up with a differentiator to be able to take an image and say, this is a cat, yes, or this is a cat, no. So typically when you think about AI, it's more like this branching logic and almost gives you like a numerical output, whether it's binary or maybe something a little more sophisticated. Now we're moving into generative AI, which is a different kind of artificial intelligence. It could produce an image. It could produce a whole series of prose. So we're really going from something that's numerical to something that's way, way more complicated in its output. Now, under the hood, it's not branching logic. It's actually different. So we morph from, thinking about a series of rules, as we've discussed, which is more classical AI, to thinking about generative AI, which works more like the human brain, which is why they call it artificial intelligence. So here, and you may have heard people talk about generative AI like, well, it's a black box. I don't know what it does, but it spits out something. And it's maybe a good analogy, but also a little bit, nerve-wracking to hear it called like that. But all of a sudden, because we have all the things Kennedy mentioned, we have very fast computing power, and then we have a new iteration of AI, particularly with the transformers, the T in ChatGPT. We're able to make that huge leap from I can only go so far with branching logic to I can take a whole bunch of data, let's say pictures of cats and pictures of dogs and pictures of lions and pictures of name whatever animal you want, feed it into a computer, and the computer almost starts creating the neural networks that we have in our brain. So we don't quite know what its logic is, but it learns if it is given a sufficient amount of data to then not just say, is this a cat or not, but be able to tell us whichever animal it is. So that's really the shift from kind of how in healthcare we've seen some things and it's had a lot of promise, let's say predictive analytics. I'm a pulmonary and critical care doc, and I remember when there was this amazing tool that was supposed to help me detect sepsis or help me detect that patient that was in the inpatient ward that was about to deteriorate, and I would be able to catch them before they needed the ICU. But somehow it never really worked. And some of that might have actually been AI, where branching logic was used to sort of develop a predictive model. And now we're in a much more sophisticated pathway where, again, we've transformed from branching logic and numerical output to almost thinking like the human brain, where we can't quite tell, exactly what's going on, let's say, in our peers' brains and in medical students' brains. But we know that we can train these brains to then be able to diagnose and detect all sorts of different things in patient care. And it's the same with thinking about generative AI. It is literally now able to take a whole tome of data if we train it with the right data set. So I'm going to translate us into healthcare and say, if we train it with enough radiology images, it can now pick up a lesion and tell us with more certainty of whether it thinks it's cancerous or not. And I'll go through some use cases. It can do even more sophisticated things to support us. But make no mistake, and I think I'm not the one that said this, but I'm going to quote one of our AMA president, our former AMA president, who said, you know what, doctors aren't going to be replaced by AI, but doctors that don't use AI are going to be replaced. And so this is our time to lean in, because we need to consider this technology as something that's gotten so sophisticated that it actually could help us. But even more so, it's like having a tool to allow us to be super doctors versus something that is adversarial. So how do we actually use generative AI? I like to think about it in three big buckets: assist, augment, and automate. So let's talk about the airline industry, because we love in healthcare talking about airline pilots and how perfect their lives are and how they really do patient safety. Well, let's talk about this in the terms of AI. So as far as assist goes, if you can think about it in terms of pilots, the autopilot function assists the pilot with the climb and descent and keeps the plane kind of on the right route. In our case, we can use AI, for example, ambient AI, and I'll go into some detail on this. So this is AI that listens to, let's say, a conversation between a physician and a patient, and then draft us a SOAP note or suggest a differential diagnosis. So it is assisting us with the type of work that we normally do. A second option is to think about AI, generative AI, in terms of augmentation. So here the analogy is, in the airline industry, you have air traffic control, and it's really hard to have one human brain look at 20 different planes that are going, up and down, that are landing, that are making their descents. And so this helps kind of coordinate and curate the data. And for us, you can think about this in terms of helping us look, let's say, at a population type of, mindset. We have a panel of 2,000 patients, and perhaps help us surface who might be a perfect candidate for a clinical trial, or help us surface care gaps we need to close. Now, clearly our brains would have to go patient by patient, but imagine if we could use AI to quickly data mine and then serve up the information that we need. And that's more augmentation. And the last is automation. And I think we all innately know this. We think about back office functions a lot, but this is taking something that we humans do, whether it's clinicians or others in the care team, and automating it, doing it faster than the human could possibly do it. And I always think about this in terms of prior auths, and not in the way that payers use it, but in the way that doctors' offices could use it, that it takes away the manual labor we have to do to submit these prior auths. So really, when you think about generative AI, this phase we're in right now with this type of technology, these are the three buckets of sort of where we want to deploy this technology. So I like to think in terms of reality, and I think about this in two axes. How frequent is the type of work we're doing and the decision-making we're doing? Is this something that occurs a lot or not so much on the y-axis? And on the x-axis, how risky is it? Is it low consequence? Or, are we diagnosing something and it's high consequence? And this is sort of the framework for thinking about how we should deploy AI, thinking across the three buckets we just discussed. Things that are low consequence potentially could be automated. Really, really good examples, back office functions. So, connecting the dots, liaising with insurance companies for prior auths, sending metrics to the various organizations that we have to report metrics to on quality and safety, things like that. On the assistance front, you can think about, and even for augmentation, we sometimes talk about this as a co-pilot metaphor. So again, not replacing the doctor, but really helping us do our jobs better. And so we can think about, and I'll share full disclosure, I'm chief clinical officer of a company called Abridge, which Josh mentioned. And we actually fall on this side where we go ahead and we actually assist with note documentation because we know it's burdensome. And then augmentation, as we discussed as well. So, maybe now I'm able to figure out which patients I think are are potentially deteriorating before they even need the ICU, and then I can intervene, or the rest of the care team can intervene. So I really think this is a good framework, because if we jump all the way to the top right of this, high volume, or actually, let's just say literally to the right of this scale, where there are high consequences, no one would feel comfortable using AI. As an industry, we need some time to understand, how does this technology work from all the different facets which we'll kind of go through. And then as we start getting familiarity, and as patients start getting familiarity, start deploying this technology for even more sophisticated things. So let's talk about a tale of 4 use cases, and they're almost in order of, the risk. We'll talk about clinical note documentation, patient portal responses, using AI for patient portal responses, using AI to summarize a chart. I don't know about you, but I spend hours doing chart biopsies and trying to figure out what's happened to my patients for the last few weeks or months sometimes. And clinical decision support. So going back to that graph I just showed you, we're going from low risk to higher and higher and higher risk, and thinking about, are we ready for AI for these use cases? Well, the answer is, it depends which use case, but I'm really happy to say that if we were to have this conversation in 6 months, I'm not sure I would say the same thing. And that's one key point, in that the technology is iterating so fast. Even if you try out something that is generative AI based now, it may be different in 2 months, and it certainly will be different in 6 months. So this is hard. Kennedy already talked about how the volume of science and evidence to guide our clinical decision-making has exponentially grown. But so on this same front, as we think about this technology, AI in healthcare, the features itself, the products itself are changing so fast that if you've used it 1 month, it may very well feel completely different if you use it again the next month. But I digress. Let's talk about clinical note documentation. So I'm going to go ahead and use my company, but we're not the only ones out there. There are other folks that have developed this solution. And the reason for developing this is to say that we know that clinicians, doctors, spend 2 hours on paperwork for every 1 hour taking care of patients. And it's not okay. And 62% of us, and this is a Medscape lifestyle and burnout report, 62% of us say that clerical work is a top cause of burnout. So now you use your phone, whether it's an app that is native to the company, or maybe even using Haiku if you're an Epic user, and you get patient consent and you start the app, and it starts recording a conversation you have in normal English with your patient. Or maybe it's multilingual, but bottom line is you're speaking as you normally would, human to human. When you're done, you create the note, and within a minute, you are served up a SOAP note that has helped with multilingual. So whether you use a translator or not, has figured out what's medical and what's not. Let's say you were talking about the Olympics. Really good ambient AI technology will recognize that as not pertinent to the medical note and actually take that out, and then structure your data and what belongs in subjective, objective assessment and plan, and serve that up to you. Now, this is not something that's coming. This is something that has been here and has been here for over a year. So I can share that, at least from what I can see working in a company like this, we're live in 55 specialties. We're used in inpatient, we're used in the ER, we're used in ambulatory. And we are actually doing what I think might be the first multi-center study in the US to look at the impact of this on clinician experience. But the pilot data is showing not only a reduction in burnout, but people are actually saving time and going home, and it's saving marriages, and people are spending time with their kids. And it's kind of like, well, when we're done with our visit, we're pretty much done with our documentation. So as far as clerical work goes, generative AI is already in use, and not in a, okay, well, I'm probably going to have to edit and spend minutes and minutes fixing something. And I think we've all been through this because we've tried different ways to support ourselves so that we don't spend forever typing. It's gotten very fast to where people are completing their notes within minutes, sometimes, even between patient visits, and they are going home after in many cases. All right, case number 2. Patient portal responses. Now, this is a paper that was published pretty recently in JAMA Network Open. And what they did was they actually looked at what generative AI could potentially do to help with all of the messages coming in from patients to clinicians. So this study was done at Stanford. It was a 5-week QI study. And what they did was they took 197 primary care and GI clinicians, so docs and APPs, and they offered them a generative AI solution that was supposed to help them respond to patients. So it would read what the patient message was, and it actually would draft it. Now, remember, regular AI would not be able to do that. It might be able to tell you what type of message it was that the patient sent in. But generative AI can ingest even prose, can do some thinking, and can actually serve you up prose back. So it's really sophisticated technology. All right, well, of course, I gave it away, and I wrote on the bottom really what the significance was. But let me actually give you a little bit more detail to what the authors found. So on one hand, when they measured time and they looked at, reply action time, the time a clinician spent writing, a time a clinician spent reading, they didn't notice a difference before using the AI technology or after the 5-week pilot period. And some of that might have been, there was a pretty low utilization rate. 20% of the messages that AI generated were ultimately used. But on the other hand, and I think this is really thought-provoking, when they measured how clinicians felt, there were significant reductions in task load and work exhaustion. So maybe it's easier to edit than to write. Maybe that was it. I think this is really, really thought-provoking and also a signal. So perhaps we're not quite ready for wide-scale deployment for this particular company that had developed this technology that was used in the Stanford study. But there's something here. For the first time, technology is actually significantly starting to make our lives easier and make it feel like there's less friction to do the things that we always do. So I like to take this as early promise, although perhaps the patient portal responses AI use case is not quite ready for prime time. But remember, it could be a matter of months or maybe even weeks. That's how quickly we're iterating with AI. All right, down to the third use case here. Chart summary. All right, I cannot wait for this to come out. And I feel like I remember talking to someone at Epic, and I'm an Epic user. I practice at RWJ, actually the same health system as Kennedy. And I remember someone from Epic saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could just summarize what happened to your patient in the last 3 months and serve you up something to the gist of since I last saw you. And that's actually what they call their product. And again, this is an area of promise. It's not quite ready for prime time. And I think what I love is that generative AI could do this for us because it's really complicated, right? If you're an ENT doctor, you're going to need chart summary in a very different way than if you're a primary care doctor. So there are nuances that we have to work through, but we have the compute and we have the technology now to take tomes and tomes of information, some good and some bad. We all know what progress notes look like in the EHR these days. We all know the pros and cons of copy forward, but to digest all of that and serve us up something that's summarized and actually clinically meaningful. So this is not coming in 5 years. I believe this is coming within the next 12 months. I strongly believe that. And of course, we have to trust but verify, but think about what would happen to our lives and how much better we would be if we could just get this served up to us right the first time around. And then moving on to clinical decision support. And if you go back to that graph and think about the X and Y axis, highest stakes, sometimes the highest, most important decisions we ever make, right? I mean, clicking through 10 little clicks to order Tylenol is nothing compared to clinical decision support to decide what antiarrhythmic to give a patient, which chemotherapy, which immunologic. There's so many complicated decisions we have to make because we are trying to base off of evidence, but every patient is different. And what I'm excited to say is that this is also on the horizon and not in a several year thing, but I think this is coming in the next 6 to 18 months. Now, all of us have been burned, or I think most of us have been burned by things that have come that say, hey, we're going to help you, doctor. We're going to help you with clinical decision support. And I think most of us still go to UpToDate because we have a lot of faith in it. And also we read it and then we make our judgments versus a pop-up that tells us what to do that is often a false positive. But I want to point out a few things here. One of the problems with clinical decision support so far, two of the biggest problems have been, one, we didn't have generative AI. We didn't have the ability to synthesize in a neural network way. We were still going through branching logic. And that would be very, very hard to perfectly branch a logic given all of the differences between our patients. Two, we might not have been using the best possible data, right? We know that EHRs are our source of truth, but we also know that a lot of the data in EHRs are not really clean. And if you have garbage in, you have garbage out. And I think that's been one of the pitfalls and something that's really taken away some of the trust in our medical community on using this kind of vanguard technology. So now imagine, I'm going to ask you to leap for a minute, especially for those of us that haven't used ambient AI. Imagine if you used ambient AI, which is something that listened to a conversation and it literally picked up the words you said as a doctor, but same with the patient and caregiver. And it inputs into the EHR in a way more accurate way. And then we use generative AI on top of that. And we take a data set that is much more clear and clean and even more detailed. We would be capturing social determinants of health, things that we never have before, maybe even disability, right? So many more data points. And then we use it to train a model and create a software that is a generative AI based that then helps us with clinical decision support. And that's kind of where we're headed. So I'm really excited about this. But of course, we need to make sure that it's safe. And a little bit of foreshadowing, and I'm nearing the end. I think I've got a couple more slides yet left. But even the federal government recognizes with great promise is, great potential for harm. And this last piece is already being heavily regulated. So that gives me a lot of solace. I'm actually going to lean in, but I'm going to be a skeptic leaning in to use this because I need to trust and verify this technology when it really comes out to my practice. All right, so what do we actually need to consider when we're thinking about bringing AI into our clinical practice? And to me, these are the 5 biggest things. The first is it's an expectation. We need to be able to trust AI and it needs to be transparent. And what's great is this is exactly what the federal government has been promoting. President Biden had an executive order on AI that came out in the last year. And this was one of the biggest tenets. Now, it was broader than healthcare. It was about AI in any use case, even outside our industry. But this is so relevant for us. As a doctor, I shouldn't have to be a machine learning engineer to be able to know exactly how the AI is working and be able to verify it at the point of care. And this is possible. And I'll give you 2 examples. I met a founder of a startup. She's a pediatrician. And what she was doing was trying to build a knowledge map, almost like trying to create UpToDate on steroids. And so it actually is generative AI that reads an EHR And then you can ask it a clinical question and it tries to spit you out an answer, but you can actually pull open the hood and look behind, and it will serially show you, almost as if it was a visualized map where you can zoom in and zoom out and actually get to the abstracts, and in some cases the papers, to where the evidence is coming from. Now that's something that, if done in a way that doesn't cognitively overload me, would fit my criteria of, I'm not a machine learning engineer, but I can trust and verify it at the point of care. So that's an example. In my company, when the AI serves up the draft SOAP note, I can actually highlight any words that the AI created, and it automatically pulls me to where this was discussed in the transcript. So again, here are two examples of a way to visualize and to help create transparency for doctors that don't require doctors to be sophisticated at machine learning or AI. We don't have time. We were trained to be doctors, and it needs to be easy for us to use at the point of care. Number two, patient safety. How do we ensure that there's patient safety? And to me, this is about going away from cute white paper and case study published on vendor website, and going away from scientific papers and getting to real evidence generation. And this is what we should be pushing for, whether it's us as a medical society, us as, advocating as we lobby to our state legislators or to federal policymakers to say, we need to expect the AI vendor industry to do clinical research, to say, you have this tool, it's being used by doctors, or maybe it's being used by patients, and what's its impact on patient safety, and what's its impact on patient outcomes, and what's its impact on clinician experience. And the thing is, these studies don't take 12 months because the technology itself is so usable. It's closer to an iPhone. It's not like when we implemented EHRs and it took us weeks to months to understand how to use the technology. AI should be so simple that it requires an hour maybe to understand how to use it. So we really can run these trials very quickly. And if you're bored, you can listen to me and also go to clinicaltrials.gov, and you'll see that there are starting to be these clinical trials that are being registered about the impact of AI. And I think that's amazing, and we should encourage that. Okay, this one, the federal government's really harping on. How do you make sure we don't worsen healthcare disparities? How do you make sure we don't add bias and discrimination because we used a data set that was, not representative of our entire patient population? And so for this, again, we need to kind of take a multifactorial approach. We need to ask the vendors, how are you thinking about bias, and how can you ensure that you're not using faulty data to feed into your model that then creates a predictive algorithm that maybe has structural racism embedded in it? And I can think of, there was a paper that I think everyone was talking about last year, where it was a generative AI model that was developed. And somehow this AI model, it was in radiology, could read chest x-rays and was extremely accurate at guessing at which chest x-ray was a Black patient and which chest x-ray was a white patient. Now that, there's no biological or physiological or radiological reason to be able to gauge those two. There's something wrong with the original training data set. But that is an example of how, without deliberative thought, we could potentially worsen bias in US healthcare. And we really need to be careful on this one. So this is about asking questions and going back to show me the evidence. Number 4, and if I die, this is the one thing I want to contribute to the world of healthcare and AI. It's getting everyone to agree that you can't bring any technology into our workplace unless you prove that it reduces our workload. So guess what? There are validated burnout tools. There are validated physician satisfaction tools. There are even validated tools to measure workload. And now we need to require that, our business, are the leaders that decide what technology to bring in, whether it's us and, we own our business, or whether we're employed by health systems, that they demand this, and that the people that create the technology actually can prove this. Because we're too far beyond, with such high rates of burnout and so many people leaving the workforce, that we can't afford to bring something in that makes our lives worse. And then the last one, and I think this is an interesting point, And I don't know how many people have used ChatGPT, but just to explain that, it's one of many different publicly available artificial intelligence engines. And what you can do is you can sign up for an account. It could be free, it could be paid. And you can then use artificial intelligence to write a termination letter, write a resignation letter, do some homework for you and try and pull PubMed references. There's actually a large language model that, is better than Dr. Google or Tina's own, PubMed skills and can pull us papers. And when we think about companies that are then coming to us saying, hey, we developed something for prior auth, I think it's important that you ask the company, do you own your entire tech stack? Have you bought a very, very large data set and then created your own large language model? And a large language model is basically a product. So it is generative AI. It is a brain that is trained to do something specific. Or did you use one of these more publicly available types of large language models like ChatGPT? The difference in those two are ChatGPT is trained off of the entire internet. So the positive is it's like being a Renaissance woman. It can do a lot of different things, but the negative is it may not get down to all the nuances we need because we're in healthcare. And when you are a company using something like that, you don't have control over updating its base data that is used to train that model. On the other side, if you own your entire technology stack, you created your own ChatGPT, let's say, as company X or startup X. You have the capacity to train that data set, to add more data to that data set and train your model to really iterate. So the next biologic that comes along, you could teach your large language model to recognize that biologic. Even though none of us can say the name, we're always going to struggle with it because that's pharma, but you have more control. And I think this is important because right now, I think our lives are so hard that if someone gives us a B minus product, it's going to help us. But in 3 or 4 months, when we expect it to turn into a B plus or an A minus or an A, this goes back to what's the capacity of that company to be able to iterate and go beyond that ceiling. Does it own its own tech stack? Is it relying on scientists or is it relying on people that were well trained, but don't have the capacity to really create the technology themselves? So that's a little bit getting in the weeds, but what I want to do is make sure that in this introductory session that you kind of get a sense of the breadth of what you should be thinking about when AI is coming your way. And I'll close with, guess what? We're not alone. There is a lot of risk involved, and people are actually working on this. So it depends what AI is being used for, but it could be regulated by FDA if it's a medical device, and there's some categories of software that fit in that definition and are regulated by FDA. But there's quite a bit that's actually regulated by another part of Health and Human Services called the Office of the National Coordinator, which a couple of weeks ago just got elevated to a formal large office. It's now the Assistant Secretary of Technology and Policy, reporting to the Secretary of HHS. And an example of that would be ambient AI for, clerical work, whether it's prior auths or medical documentation or SOAP notes. That's not regulated by FDA. It's actually regulated by ONC. And that office, and Kennedy kind of mentioned this as he was going through the timeline, but that office regulates or really determines what EHRs need to provide in order to get Medicare payments. And now they're kind of using that same pathway to say, for this kind of AI about clerical work, we're also going to give criteria. I bring this up to say they've already released regulations for decision support, AI that's used for clinical decision support. And they now have some criteria. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be trustworthy. It needs to be free from bias. So there are quite a few things that will go into effect, I think, by January 27. And what I love is that there are guardrails out there. And now we really need to just see the rubber meet the road. So I mentioned Biden had an executive order on safe and trustworthy AI. One of the things that we saw coming out of this is that every single agency in the executive branch now has a chief AI officer. So DOD has it, Health and Human Services has it, VA has it. And now we have experts coming into the federal government thinking about AI strategy, both internal for the department, but also for the industries. And then I'll also say, and I think this was February this year, but the House created a task force on AI, and there are some doctors on that task force, and that makes me really excited. Do we need to do a better job educating our congressional members on how to use AI in healthcare? Yes. But hey, at least they're looking at it. And the whole goal is to allow innovation, but to set some really strong guardrails so that it doesn't hurt us as practicing clinicians and it doesn't hurt our patients. And then I'll close with the AMA, which is the purple one here, the National Academy of Medicine, which is kind of the bottom white graphic, and CHAI, which is the Coalition for Healthcare AI, have all released standards getting at the ethics and the safe use. So we're starting to see these really big, thought leadership entities start to give us more teeth and more framing and shaping so that we don't just use this technology willy-nilly and it's a net negative, that it is hopefully a net positive. And with that, I'll actually stop. And I just want to say thank you for everyone to, pay attention and listen. It is a breaking subject, but also a complicated subject. And I hope our presentations were helpful.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I do believe we have a little bit of time for Q&A. And I actually see a hand is up. So I will say, Dr. Campagnolo, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I mean, this was marvelous. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you,
That's
Mary.
good.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So yeah, I love the history that you gave, Kennedy and Tina. You really generated a lot of questions in my mind, but I'll try to narrow it to a little smaller number of questions. The thing I was thinking, because I've been using DAX for notes, and I found it really helpful, but not perfect. And I guess though what I worry about with AI and say using it for portal messages and that is that I think the human tendency, and I may be wrong, but I think the human tendency, including for myself, is that you start to get used to something doing something for you, and then you may not always question it. I mean, I think about GPS. You still need to use some common sense sometimes because GPS isn't perfect. So I didn't know if there was some way that, I mean, how do we determine going forward that if we're using AI, that people are not kind of cutting corners, letting things slide, and maybe they're being directed in the wrong direction? And I guess that also then led me to start to think about like how has the legal profession started to look at some of this. And again, on the I think the lawyers that are often oppositional to us tend to be on the fringes, like when there's a gray area, new technology, there's sometimes danger for us. And so I was just curious about like, what do we see happening in that arena?
I'll start, and then I want to hear what Kennedy has to say on this too, because I'm just going to say, if we were to take AI en masse, I think I would not be able to answer this question. So maybe I can go back to what you said about using DAX ambient AI to write your notes, because there's so many different use cases for AI. In that case, the assumption is, and it doesn't matter what vendor it is, but the assumption is, hey, doctor, we're drafting this for you, but just like you have to co-sign resident notes, you are required to review. In reality, are people reviewing? But also I'll argue in reality, are people reviewing resident notes? So we don't quite have a gold standard comparison. And I think this goes back to thinking about cultural beliefs and then doing the clinical research to see what's happening. But on one hand, we're starting with something that's pretty low stakes. If we were on clinical decision support, the stakes are too high. If we were really using that to guide cancer treatments at this point, I think everyone would, we would revolt as a physician community. So we're learning a lot right now. And I'll just share, I actually lead our clinical research arm, and we're now going through and starting to get closer to patient safety and patient outcomes. We need to measure this. Some of it might be just literally having observations of clinicians using AI, and hopefully it's not going to feel like, like someone is watching you, and we can find other ways. I'll segue a little bit to say on the legal side, the upside is the legal community has not completely coalesced. And I'll say when we're negotiating contracts, we talk a lot about how there's no AI company that wants to create a shadow medical record. I know my company doesn't, right? Like we don't want to hold on to the audio of a medical, conversation that a doc had with their patient. On the other hand, physicians don't always finish their notes on day one or like 30 minutes right after they saw the patient. So we need to hold on to it for a little while in case they want to go back. So I think there isn't consensus across the legal, like the healthcare legal industry on kind of how to treat AI. And this is our opportunity as physicians to, I think, be the dog and not the tail and sort of set guidelines. Because what we don't want is for it to be so onerous that we can't use the technology. I don't know if anyone's seen this, but the FSMB, oh my gosh, I can never say it, the Federation of State Medical Boards, released some guidance talking about AI. And in that, they said physicians are responsible for, talking about how they used AI. And if the AI suggests something, why they didn't exactly go with what AI suggested. And I'm hearing anecdotally that a lot of clinicians are like, well, fine, I'm not using clinical decision support, like the risk of CYA is too high. So I think I don't have an answer, but these are the conversations I've heard. Kennedy, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, thank you, Tina. And Mary, yes, always the thought-provoking question. First of all, I think when we're starting to, I think the key to understanding our colleagues is the variable attention to cognitive load. And I think cognitive load is really the key to this argument, right? Clinicians tend to blow by things when they feel that they're behind, okay, or when they feel they're overwhelmed. Yes, when burnout is starting to happen, then it goes from oh, I can't do this to I won't do this, or I don't care to do this anymore. So that's where as we roll out the technology, to all of our frontline physicians, is that we also have to make sure we implement it, slow it down a bit. Okay. Remember, the theme of my part of the talk was how we've gotten to a point where we've had literally lightning pace. And Tina, continued to accentuate we have lightning pace. So how do we take this technology and convince our colleagues we're trying to slow things down? Hey, this will write your note, but please edit it, okay? Because this is a double-edged sword. Right? If you don't read, if you don't edit, and again, I think there will be more intelligence to adapt and self-correct over time. But until we get there, in this watershed moment in sort of AI history, I think we need to continue to encourage best practices, best documentation practices. That doesn't go away. And we have to impress upon that from leaders, from CMOs, from president of medical staff to really self-regulate before the government comes and tries to regulate this. And they will, but if we, again, the way we serve as our own Kevlar, our own armor, is through the process of self-regulation and, both through the Medical Society of New Jersey, through the AMA, through organized medicine, making sure that our colleagues have access to best practices and best recipes to deal with these kind of things. And so that's there. Legal, I don't think they have yet understood how to approach or find the right set of tools to go through the mountain of data, okay? They're experts, that usually testify to these things. Are they keeping up with the technology? Are they keeping up with the outcomes? Can they interpret the studies? Will the expert of yesterday be useful today? I think we're seeing a little bit of lag, and that's a good thing, so that we can shore up our legal risk and our medical legal risk by finding the mistakes in what we do. So at RWJ Barnabas Health, we are actually piloting multiple platforms. We are currently piloting DAX Copilot. We will be, for transparency purposes, piloting a bridge very soon. And what we're already finding through our users through workflows, okay, looking at how is this optimized for certain workflows and where does it not work. Right now, ambient technologies, ambient AI has a weakness with multiple users, and that's really in the case of residents and fellows. So there are some issues there, especially with teaching attendings. But that is, within, just like Tina said, within a week to 6 months, that's probably going to be solved. That's how fast the iterative technology is working. And then also in pediatrics with, multiple parents, multiple interviewers, that kind of thing. How do we capture that? So those are challenges technologically that I think will continue to even vex the legal community. So I think we're in a safe zone due to their ignorance, probably for the next couple of years, but you will see them come up with AI tools versus our AI tools, as usually the cat and mouse game happens with us and our friends in the legal profession. So, and Dr. Like has been waiting for a while, so.
Well, first of all, thank you both for two superb presentations. Really, really learned a lot. My main bucket of questions relates to the discussion on bias and inequity mitigation, particularly from a health equity standpoint. And what I want to say is MSNJ just had an excellent seminar on Section 1557, their final rule, which specifically calls out patient decision support aids, as well as working with interpreters and disability-related issues. And so some of my healthcare attorney colleagues are really zeroing in on flawed data sets, whether it's pulse oximetry and the biases with its use with people who are darker skinned, GFR, pulmonary function tests, cardiovascular disease, risk calculators, and see this as a major area for potential litigation that's going to be coming up. So I'm sort of wondering, to what degree has the AI industry and companies looked at the implications of Section 5057, which became live as of July 4th, and has discussion about these patient decision support aids? And to what degree do you think AI could be used to detect bias and detection within data sets, almost like a sniffer that could pick up gender or age or ability status or racial biases? So that's my first general set of questions.
Man, I love this. I almost want to go backwards. I would love to use AI as a sniffer because it can process way faster than the human brain can, or whatever we use to data mine at present moment. So I think the possibilities are endless. I mean, we could quickly look through claims data and make basically pump out 10 or 20 times the number of papers looking at differential care by whatever your segmentation is, whether it's geography or gender identity or race, what have you, your social economic status. I think that would be huge. Here's an interesting one we're discussing in our company. One of our health system partners is really curious. And in our company, we have the ability to, we can see how long a visit takes, right? Because we're recording it. We could also segment and be able to say, well, how much does the doctor talk and how much does the patient talk? And there's something curious that one of our health systems wants to investigate, which is, when someone has a lower literacy level, does the doctor overtalk on top of that patient? Do we tend to overtalk over immigrants versus, native English speakers? So I think there's kind of unprecedented ability to do that. As far as 1557, I think is the right term.
Yep.
I think it depends what the AI solution is. I know Ambient AI, the vendors we've discussed so far, that tool, Ambient AI to draft your SOAP notes is not considered a patient decision aid. So it's actually not falling under that. But in my company, it's come up because we actually also produce at the same time of the SOAP note a patient visit summary in normal language. And we've been asked like, oh yeah, but can you translate this to Spanish? We have Spanish speakers. And then we run into trouble where it comes back to that. So at this point, we haven't gone that far. We'd love to, but we have some work to do to be in compliance.
Right. The bold statement I would make, and I can be critiqued on this, is I think the null hypothesis is that existing data sets are biased.
Oh, without doubt, Bob. Without doubt. I mean, and that's where I think I can speak to more of a deeper evolution in medicine as we're going from the informatics standpoint, is looking at our core data collection, our core assumptions. and looking at how do we normalize certain things. So for example, the estimated glomerular filtration rate, there's a black versus non-black. Now that's now been debunked by nephrology. We now know that's becoming more and more public. So in some of the things I'm working at and I have privy to is now although you have to report them, you don't calculate, you now have to normalize those calculations into single values, number one, and move away from those separate ranges, which in fact has been mandated by law. So there's several health policy unravelings we have to do here, but really normalizing that data set and going back and saying, okay, we now know where our biased observations are in our infrastructure. So how do we go and correct that? So that's the long-term fix for some of the bias propagating forward, because we practice, we want to practice culturally competent medicine, but racially sensitive. And again, racially is a socioeconomic construct. It's not a biological construct, as we know. So again, at this point, I think when you look at that 1557 rule and when you look at companies, I think healthcare companies are going to react very, very quickly. And I think that the AI community is going to be back on its heels. It has enough that it's doing to compete with each other, to innovate networks, to how do you innovate and then keep the guardrails and listen to how this whole thing is being regulated. So yes, current data sets are flawed. They are based on flawed data. It's decades of inaccurate observations or tangential or even flawed observations. So we know that we're wrong, and where we find we're wrong, we'll fix it, whether it comes to the model or comes to the data.
I ask one other quick question on a totally different topic. What do you see as the implications of this for teaching in medical schools, particularly if the AI can generate SOAP notes and do all of this? Do we still need to teach first-year medical, second-year, and third-year medical students all this sort of stuff? Or are we going to start cutting corners on that going forward? Because a lot of students coming in are obviously into this technology and using it.
Hello.
Well, I'll take a stab at that, having dealt with, creating informatics courses and whatnot previously, and working on new coursework at Rutgers, Robert Wood Johnson Med School. I think classic medical teaching, we have to continue to work on the basis, teaching clinical decisions, fundamental clinical decisions. How do you gather data, process data, generate a diagnosis, test that diagnosis? How do you follow through with the patient and manage, preferably on a continuity of care basis, which, hopefully more people will go into. So with that being said, I think you teach the thinking, you teach the documentation. Again, the documentation methodology will change, but I don't think in where we are as an informatics department at RWJBH, we're not looking to unleash this technology for students. Definitely not at this point. A lot of these helpful guides and aids we don't share with students. Even when I was at Cooper Medical School, we've had access to Dragon Medical One. They would see me use it. I'll say, hey, this is how you would use it, but don't use it because I need to see your thought process. Again, the core of how we communicate through the note should be optimized to reduce boilerplate text, increase meaning, and convey, clinical thinking. Those are the fundamentals, and we should still stick to those. But I think medical students will have to, I think right now where we are with Epic in particular, smart phrases, smart notes, and then pulling in data, understanding where that comes in, I think is very reasonable. But then to have an auto note generated, to be able to then have certain AI assumptions, I think they should be trained in it, particularly as residents. And I think that should really be the purview of the practicing attending physician.
So I really have mixed feelings on this one. And I'm just going to limit my answer to AI to reduce paperwork, because I think AI for clinical decision support feels very scary to me, given learners are honing that craft. But I will say personal experience with my fellows, and then, my colleagues that use it for their residents, this kind of technology, our company's tech, is that we find that the trainees are more present and we can press them on differential more. They're spending less time doing low value work, and we get more of their eyeballs and more of their brain. And I really love that. So I can see a positive. I have mixed feelings about this for interns. I'm not sure. There's something too about writing the note and synthesizing it. But on the other hand, can this be a med-ed teaching tool where we can use this to help give almost real-time feedback to, if we trust the note output, give real-time feedback to trainees on here's how, for the exact same conversation encounter you just had, how you could write the note and help them sort of calibrate to an actual gold standard, because we really don't have one right now. So I think the jury's still out. I find there's a lot of promise, but this is a trust and verify situation.
If
Thank
I
you.
can jump in with a quick question. I'm sure that physicians who work for larger health systems will have some, although not all of this question answered for them by leadership and by management, but even more so for physicians who work in smaller, or even going down to very small, almost solo practices. What can a physician reasonably do to, I guess, A, stay on top of the incredibly rapid development in AI offerings, and B, decide which to use and which, at least for the time being, to forego?
I think they need to be members of MSNJ.
Correct.
Saying,
That's a no-brainer. Well, I'm going to cut you off here, Tina. Let's let the strength of what Tina and I talk about, and it's on the shoulders of organized medicine that we can talk and research and really develop a lot of these things. Patient safety, physician burnout. I mean, these all have common roots long ago. And we were different branches of the same tree, right? So at this point, no, it really is, you have to be a part of a group, okay? Big group thinking, okay? Understanding and, go where the food is, go where the money is, right? And to keep our physicians independent, the Medical Society of New Jersey, really for the broad issues, the practice related issues, the implementation issues, understanding data, again, being an original partner with New Jersey High Tech and Meaningful Use, being the, rolling out One Health New Jersey. I mean, MSNJ can be and should be a trusted source for physicians for health information technology and its news. Again, we partner with other organizations. We get information. Another group is the Health and the New Jersey HIMSS, Health Information Management System Society. Usually you might have a membership. But again, I would recommend physicians to really watch MSNJ, subscribe, get e-news, because again, we're building more infrastructure at MSNJ. We're building infrastructure at AMA that Tina could speak to. This is going to be a permanent thing in organized medicine. And I really think that will be the source of truth again, because at our hearts, even as health IT experts, informaticists, patient safety is the center of what we do.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And then I just want to make one thing clear. This is not about textbook. This is about I'm going to call them influencers, but the people at the bleeding edge that are posting all the time on LinkedIn or posting all the time on X. That is actually the way. Maybe the third, which is maybe a little more accessible, would be, I'm going to say, Googling podcasts where different AI companies are being interviewed, but it sure isn't textbook. By the time we wait for a textbook, it's going to be out of date. So kudos for joining this, because I think me and Kennedy are kind of at the middle. In fact, we are having some side conversations in our job roles about AI, and we're on different sides of the coin. But it is moving so fast that if anyone says I've written a book about it or here's a textbook, they're behind.
Mary, question?
Yeah, it was kind of more a comment. I liked what both of you were saying in response to Josh's question, but I guess I was wondering what our thoughts have been around we were trying to develop, I think, a group of us within MSNJ to do like AI and other technology evaluations. And it would seem to me that could be a member service that, I know some of our, AMA and AFP, I know nationally have done like innovation centers, but whether there's something like that we could look at in New Jersey, because I know there's, same as with EHRs are sometimes built for large systems versus smaller practices. I think there's also, what I've seen so far, technology tools and AI for note documentation, at least, that some are designed on a smaller practice model versus, the ones that are going to interface with Epic would be probably more likely to be under a larger health system. So just wondering if that might be something that we should do as an organization, like look at different products and help to, not that we're going to support one product over another necessarily, but say, here's a group of products that could be good for the small practice doctors versus, help to lead them towards ones that might be more amenable to their work.
Mary, yes, and yes. Parallel efforts. We're putting together that health technology and informatics task force that's in process, under construction. Tina is also, and I'm looking to jump on at the AMA level to see how their effort at the AMA is going on there. So looking forward to, yes, looking at exploring, different tools at different strata of practice and affordability. I think that's a huge member benefit and something we need to understand just of the industry itself. And then finally, making sure that trusted sources of information. So, the other big thing for a lot of our physicians is that what is the big medical system pushing? What are they mandating? How do you use this? How do you use this? This is what's happening. It's good to share, but clearly, the soul of private practice is I want to have my own resources and I want to do my own thing. So we have to keep that focus. We also have to make sure that our big system partners, play ball like that. But recognizing that it's the patient-physician relationship, and that still exists on very small one-to-one levels, that has to be protected. Whether it's health IT, advocacy, or even just donating to right causes. I think that's still all important to do, and it's the same thing.
That's great. Thank you so much. I don't see any other participants with raised hands. So at this point, I would like to thank our amazing participants for this extremely informative, really eye-opening in many ways discussion. Really cannot thank you enough for joining us and dedicating your time and giving us the benefit of your wisdom and your expertise on this. Thank you, Dr. Shah, Dr. Ganti, so much. Really appreciate it. And to everyone on the call, stay tuned. Our MSNJ lecture series will continue in the coming months with episode 5. So stay tuned for information on the next iteration of our series. And at this point, I will end our call. So thank you again. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.